So I want to break down the REBA 2002 amendment so that ultimately we'll be able to understand why Form 801. In fact, I don't even want to suggest or mention who, because I'm sure this question or comment has come from various people. Yesterday, somebody said, I think you should tear it up, and that's why I kind of thought about it when I first started, when I said it here today. But technically, the answer cannot be, oh, that's easy, let's just get rid of it or shorten it, because what's on there is in relationship to the amendment under REBA 2002. So I want to start with that, and ultimately there are other topics under REBA 2002 with regards to offer handling. In fact, if you've talked or spoken with RICO, or if you've had any presentations you've attended, even from the complaints perspective, yes, we have phantom offers as a curious environment. Have there been complaints? How many complaints? You know, that type of thing, and what do we do to make sure we don't have any phantom offers or hypothetical scenarios somebody's telling us is real in our offer environment. But the real issue is in offer handling, which is much more oriented around some of the other sections, adding integrity, acting with professionalism, making sure that we treat people fairly, making sure we don't interfere with other people's clients, making sure things are written and legible. All of those, plus a few more, are actually in the offer handling environment. So what we did come across in this year's changes or amendments was the very specific environment of two things. One, you can't say you have an offer, or you can't insinuate or represent. I don't want to use that term because it deals with agency sometimes in our mind, plays around with us, but you can't represent to anybody you have an offer unless, everybody can do this now, it's way past the time. It's signed, it's in writing, and it's signed. Can you imagine that had to actually be put into the legislation? I mean, most of us would have said, isn't that what was happening before? So that's an easy one. I'm going to get past that. I'm not even going to break it down. Moving to the next one, which is retention of records. Ultimately, this is the only other change that triggered the Form 801 for OREA to provide a sample form or a document that will satisfy if you choose to use the option of retaining a summary document instead of the whole offer itself. So it's as simple as Form 801 is the result to enable you to have an option to an option. If you choose not to, keep the whole offer. If you choose to create your own, create your own. But what happens is when we create a sample or a summary document that will allow you to comply with the legislation it needs to comply with the legislation. And there are 9 bullets in the legislation specific to what has to be included on a summary document. We just happen to have numbered it and called it the OREA Form 801 Offer Summary Document. But if you choose to make your own, make sure you include everything that's on that list, whatever format, whatever date reference or date numbering you use, that's fine. It doesn't matter to us. In fact, I've said to people it's not mandatory to use it. So at the end of the day, that's all I wanted to say. It's an option to an option. So let's move to that very issue of record retention. I would say consistently I've seen these questions, but we have just posted an FAQ file with, I don't know, it's got to be 40 or 50 questions. And we had some blog questions as well, but we've updated it. But I find these are pretty frequent. And so what we're going to do is first identify that the realtor conversation is around, the questions of trading activity and the form or the legislation amendment requirement. So I'm going to flip those, and we're going to actually look at when Form 801 was presented on the basis of the 2 sections of the Act, and I'm going to start with the fact that it was presented to members in May of 2015. There was a minor change in June, which was essentially to parenthesize the counteroffer section, so everybody understood there's 2 signature parts just for that purpose. If you have a counter. In fact, we put it in there in the first place because various sources, including committee, including the registrar, including various contacts at RICO, it would probably be a healthy thing for a member to be able to use a form twice in this environment. So we put the counter. What we did in September was realize, and there's nothing etched in stone in standard forms, and really sometimes legislation, even though it seems like that sometimes. At the end of the day, in September, what we realized was that to streamline the form, we could remove the counter section from the listing brokerage because the majority of the time, if a salesperson was going to use this form twice, the salesperson working with the buyer, they were going to provide the form with the counter section complete from their buyer, having already the top section filled out, and then the form would be blank at the bottom. So a seller listing brokerage would always have a blank section. They didn't need the counter. And I was so happy to see the bold line separating top from bottom and have a little more white space. So that's all we did in September. In fact, you'll notice that at the bottom of the form, including on the 2016 version, that there's September 2015, and that's the revised date, the last revised date. Doesn't mean it won't change again. That's just saying that's what the most current version is. So let's go back to the questions. We'll flip them around again and ask, is it mandatory? Now that we've had a little discussion together, these are your answers. Hopefully they'll be overwhelmingly consistent, or I have an issue with my 20 minutes. So number one, is it mandatory? It is up to you to use this one or to simply use an offer summary document. Keep a copy of the offer if you wish. I mean, we have all kinds of other surrounding environments to offer handling, and particular to the retention. We're still getting a lot of questions from members. Do I have to keep the counter offers from the seller to the buyer? So I'm going to add that in there for just a split second. Do you need to keep seller counter offers to the buyer? And I'm going to add one part. According to the retention section 35.1, no. Do you need to keep, forget 35.1, do you need to keep copies of seller offers to buyers? If anybody participated in our webinar jointly with Rico on November 10th, it is probable that you want to have some tracking of any offers between buyer, seller, seller, buyer. That's another section of the Act. That's making sure that you have information, making sure you can protect and promote your seller, and part of that is going back with things you did with them. So that's fair. But ultimately, in this section, you do not need seller to buyer. You, as a listing brokerage rep, only need every offer that comes in, every single offer. So I like to use the example of something simple like price. Buyer comes in, listing brokerage, receives an offer from another salesperson. Let's not go into multiples. All you have to do is multiply the numbers at this point. So you have a cooperating rep sending an offer to you for, let's just say, $300,000, and the seller says, oh, that's crazy, tell them to go away. Does nothing. They come back 2 days later, and they submit another offer for let's go with 30. Give them 30,000 more. Seller says, well, you know what? That's not bad, but I want 350. So he signs it back. The buyer comes back third time at 348. And it doesn't sell, it's unsuccessful because they're just not happy with all the terms. How many offers for the purpose of this section under retention do you need to have for the listing brokerage file? If you're not using a summary document, how many offers? If it was a 6-page offer, 3. 3 times 6 is 18. Now, if you take that right out of residential, typical residential resale, put it into new home or put it into commercial, I don't know if I have any commercial folks or new home folks, you now might have 3 times 23, 3 times 54, however many offer pages you had in that particular environment. It's not a final copy with all renditions within. It's a full 6 pages of every offer received from a buyer. Period. That's why some, not all, some choose to go with this 1-page summary document. Now, you may have documentation oriented around the seller counter before it failed and was unsuccessful, but that's, as we said earlier, a different section, different issue. So just to keep things simple, it's not mandatory. Does the seller sign it? There's nowhere to have the seller sign or initial because in the legislation it doesn't require it. If a member wants to do anything to the form that we provide other than copyright, we don't say anything about it. So if you wish your seller to sign it and then put it in your file, fine. But no, it's not a requirement because it's not part of the 9 bullets required. Then we ask, is it only for multiple offers? No, it's for every single offer that you receive on behalf of your seller. Can it be done at the end of a sale? We just went through that example, so the answer would be no. And the tricky part, and I won't resolve this, but the tricky part would be the brokerage who's expecting these copies to make sure if Rico asked in a month from now that they have all the copies, and by the way, the listing may not be sold yet. So if there was a question about an offer presentation 3 weeks ago and the listing brokerage doesn't have copies, they have to chase down the salesperson to get copies of the offers for retention. So when are they presented? That's another issue. That's your brokerage to make some of these decisions. But at the end of the day, it's not at the end of the sale. Every copy that comes in untouched, every copy needs to be retained for unsuccessful offers. And by the way, I didn't put it up here, but for how long? Anybody know? 1 year. Into this section. Successful trades, listings, buyer representation, 6 years. Moving forward, can a listing rep do the Form 801? Might be a little tricky on this one. We're going to go with no because there's one thing on there that the cooperating brokerage, assuming a cooperating brokerage exists, can do and has to do, and that is the signature of the buyer. And by the way, the signature of the buyer is a requirement under the 9 bullets under that section. Must sales reps keep a copy of any Form 801? Now, technically under this section, the answer is no, but let me ask you, how many people keep copies of your listings or your BRAs or your agreements when you submit to the listing brokerage? Right? A lot of people. You may want to keep copies, but it's not a requirement. This is a brokerage obligation, hence my last comment, which is when do they get it from the salespeople? Right? It's a brokerage obligation. Why more paperwork? Well, this is kind of interesting because I actually asked this on the webinar, and I always say, who knows? If you look at 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and I use 10-year increments on purpose, we just have more paperwork because we need more written communication, documentation, integrity. Well, there is another environment to answer this, and that is the legislation says so, period. Right? That's kind of the other one where, you say because I said so, but we don't like saying that. This is just an optional single page compared to the actual 6 pages. And the last one, are there answers? Yes, there are, and that sort of leads me into some of the actual resources that OREA has tried to provide. There are other resources, but as far as OREA, what we wanted to do was share with you, one, you may want to check your brokerage policies because we don't cause it to be mandatory for brokerages to use it as simple and as straightforward as we've presented it. There may be other policies. Someone says try to get a Form 801 on every listing offer that you receive. And that's to enable them to use a 1-page instead of using a 6-page retention document. So again, it goes back to communication and working together to try to pass this learning curve like we have many other environments. So let's go to take a look at the resources. We have some webinars. We have the July, we have the November, we have the tutorial, we have the update tutorial. I mentioned I just put up the actual FAQs, which is quite extensive, so hopefully they'll be helpful to you. You can always email standardforms@orea.com. The standard forms that are landing page on orea.com is a member sign-in, and we can't put anything standard forms related on public domain. So that's why you need to sign in whenever you're trying to retrieve anything oriented around the forms, whatever form it is. The other thing is that we do have a blog. If you are looking for something that was a little while ago, you just have to put it in the search. If you put Form 801, it just pops right up again. And you'll see OREAblog.com is a public OREA blog source. Therefore, we don't have as many questions as we have on the FAQ file that's on the actual standard forms page link. So you'll be able to pop it up and take a look at those based on what we had in July and a little bit more in August. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about on the resource before we just hit the other 2 topics is the resource of the Forms Explained. So we have a red line version. I think most of us are familiar from previous versions, but we actually have these that are called Forms Explained. So it helps to say pretty much what we've just said about Form 801. There are, by the way, now, last year we had 10 forms explained at 801, that's 11. We now have 22 forms explained on OREA.com landing page. Our aim is to double those because it will answer questions and help you with consumers to work through some of the forms, which are there to add integrity and help you through the process of trading, listing, and sales. So let's take a look at the Electronic Commerce Act. As I said earlier, this is going to be the easier part of my session here. The Electronic Commerce Act, we had a simple amendment, which sort of takes me back in recollection. In 2002, the act was proclaimed. We had already been lobbying back in 2000, probably 1999, I haven't said that for a while, 2000, 2002. They said, you know what, we think we fixed the real estate issues. We simply put a real estate title document exclusion, which really wasn't what we wanted to fix some of the questions and the discussions about regulations. So from that point, we lobbied again, and finally we were we allowed, or we were on the receiving end of the fact that they were going to actually remove the exclusion. And we didn't want any regulations, so they also decided that there'd be no regulations pertaining to the real estate title documents or real estate documents, period, leaving us in these kinds of forums and questions and answers on our own in our brokerages as well with our consumers. So what they did was one simple amendment. Let's start with that. They took the ECA, they took the exclusion out. Done. We sent a memo in July to members just basically telling them that's what was changed, not a host of other things. Now, within that same breadth of communication, we also identified there are certain sections of the Act that you should be aware of as a reminder. Things should be in writing, you should be retaining documents, you should be having your signed documents. You should make sure that there is an electronic signatures, and you may not see as far away as the back, but just taking a look at an e-signatures, identity assurance. you have your tracking or audit trail, you have the storage, the document integrity, very much what others have been talking about today. So that's the ECA and the categories. In September, we sent another memo to broker of records. Because we've been asked, well, why don't you provide policies, or why don't you help us through where we go, how do we choose? And the bottom line is that, as I think John Ross mentioned about the broker of record or the brokerage not making a decision, either the salesperson or the brokerage makes choices, and you'll hear from our panel as well as you have already heard somewhat. You want to be able to actually do the trials or make some choices, what's going to be best for you and your consumers, your clientele, because it's going to feel a little different with different software. It's going to be a learning curve as much as some of these other changes with REBA. So we reissued the brokerage to the broker of record a memo to all the broker of records, the categories which we felt would be recommended to have brokerage policies. And they being the same as we just looked at. Things should be in writing, there should be identity assurance, there should be an audit trail, there should be the document storage and things of that nature, the same things that we talked about. And then we mentioned that we had various providers, there it is there, and it is up to the brokerage. And if the brokerage doesn't establish them, then the salespeople within the brokerage should have conversations with the brokerage, and then just make sure you know if there are any, and if you're complying, questions answered within your brokerage. Those are choices. Now, my last topic, and we'll get to a little bit more of that. So on the last topic, I just wanted to add in that environment of there's not really ever going to be an end when you think about, okay, we got Form 801, we have the Agreement of Purchase and Sale. We look at the bigger picture. REBA itself affects our trading activity. We know that there are certain things that have to be within a file. Part of it's brokerage policy. Sometimes they have a form that has to go to the brokerage when you list or you sell. Part of it is REBA 2002, and the other part, of course, is the consumer in the marketplace that might tweak you to do some kind of follow-up document or some kind of adding integrity. If I were to look at the bare minimum in a file, hopefully you would agree, I would suggest that, and I've gray shaded them on purpose. You have your brochure, working with a realtor, you have the relationship, service agreement, whether it's customer or client. You have, of course, the confirmation, cooperation, and representation, the agreement of purchase and sale. You hope a trade record, and then you hope for waivers, confirming, firming up, and that type of thing. But there may be, as you see in the shaded area, mutual release terminations and possible other disclosures or documents. That's your bare minimum. Has anybody ever had a file that's like 1/8 of an inch thick? Probably not. And the reason is because we add, and I do have a lot of faith and confidence in the industry coming from it, we add a lot of documentation for our discovery, disclosure, and adding integrity. Now this may not be your average file, but I was trying to establish what else is in there. We have a host of FinTrack docs. We have the existing previous slide, and then we have some standard forms that are there to add integrity, discovery, and disclosure as choices. You may have your own you'd add to your list. Take your last half a dozen files, take a look at the list of files that you or forms that you pull out of it, and then say, do I need to add more to add the integrity? And so this is where I'll leave you as far as contemplate, consider, speak out, ask out, give suggestions, and ultimately what we'll do is just make sure that if there's a need, we'll try to provide it, and then from there, it's choices. Thank you. It's a lot of information in about 20 minutes. I'll leave that because I just see one gentleman getting a capture. What I'm going to do next is it's just a little thank you with an email slide. I'll just make sure I take a scan. There's all done. All right. We want you to be able to contact us, give suggestions, give input, maybe even participate, seek out, and then spell it out in your own documentation file. And of course, you can always communicate with us, and you can always communicate with others in your brokerage who can forward it, whichever path it takes. These forums are only helpful if they're helpful to you. You may choose not to use one, but another. And I hope that that will encourage you to actually continue your questions and input, because it's not always a question.